Much of what you are taught about the French Revolution is either incomplete or dangerously oversimplified. The familiar version usually goes something like this. There was a decadent queen, an out-of-touch king, and a mob of angry peasants who stormed a fortress, chopped off some heads, and changed the world. It is a tidy narrative. Liberty against tyranny, the people against the crown. And it makes for a compelling story, which probably explains why it has endured for so long. But the reality is considerably more unsettling. Because the French Revolution was not really born in the streets of Paris on the 14th of July, 1789. It was born in the ledger books, in backroom loans negotiated by Swiss bankers, in volcanic ash drifting across the Atlantic from Iceland, in a trade deal with Britain that nobody talks about, and in a war fought on behalf of American colonists who never paid France back. The real origin of the French Revolution is a story about debt, about weather, about deception, about the arrogance of a ruling class that believed it could borrow its way out of anything, and about the catastrophic consequences of what happens when that belief finally collapses. So let me walk you through what actually happened, because once you see the full picture, you will never look at this revolution in the same way again. To understand why France fell apart in 1789, you have to go back decades before the first barricade was erected. You have to begin with the finances. And France's finances were already disastrous long before Louis XVI took the throne. 18th century France was an extraordinarily powerful nation. It had the largest population in Western Europe, somewhere around 28 million people by the late 1780s. It had a massive military, a vast colonial empire, a rich agricultural base, and cultural influence that stretched across the continent. French was the language of diplomacy. Versailles was the envy of every court in Europe. By nearly every outward measure, France appeared to be the dominant continental power. But beneath this magnificent surface was a fiscal system that was rotten to its core, and it had been rotten for generations. The French tax system was medieval in the most literal sense. It had been built up over centuries through a patchwork of regional arrangements, noble exemptions, clerical immunities, and overlapping jurisdictions that made the whole thing almost incomprehensible. The crucial point to understand is this. The people who owned the most land and held the most wealth, the nobility and the clergy, paid almost nothing in taxes. The first estate, the clergy, owned roughly 10% of all the land in France and paid no direct taxes at all. Instead, they gave the crown a voluntary gift every 5 years, and they decided how much that gift would be. The second estate, the nobility, were exempt from most direct taxes as well, particularly the taille, which was the main land tax. As a result, the burden of financing the French state fell overwhelmingly on the third estate, the commoners, who made up 98% of the population and owned the least. Peasants, artisans, small merchants, even the rising professional class of lawyers and doctors, they were the ones paying, and the burden on them was severe. And it was not just the taille. There was the gabelle, a deeply hated tax on salt that was enforced with extraordinary cruelty. In certain provinces, every household was required to purchase a minimum quantity of salt from the government at inflated prices, regardless of whether they needed it or could afford it. Salt inspectors could enter homes without warning to ensure compliance. Peasants who were caught buying cheaper smuggled salt could be imprisoned or even sentenced to the galleys. The gabelle fell almost entirely on the poor, and its arbitrary enforcement made it one of the most despised features of the old regime. There were also the corvées, which were obligations for peasants to provide free labor for the construction and maintenance of roads and other public works. A farmer could be pulled away from his own fields during the most critical weeks of the growing season and forced to work on a road that primarily served the local nobleman's estate. And on top of all these direct burdens, the Catholic Church collected its own tithe, the dime, which took roughly 1/10 of agricultural produce from every peasant household. So, when people talk about the oppression of the French peasantry, it was not abstract. It was a daily grinding reality of being squeezed from every direction by a system that had been designed over centuries to extract maximum wealth from those who had the least and channel it to those who had the most. At this point, a reasonable person might ask, why didn't the king just reform the tax system and make the wealthy pay their share? And the answer is that multiple kings and their ministers tried, and every single time they were blocked, not by the people, but by the elites. France had institutions called parlements, and these were not legislatures in the modern sense. They were regional courts staffed by hereditary magistrates, wealthy nobles who had purchased their positions and whose primary function was to register royal edicts into law. If a parlement refused to register an edict, it effectively had veto power, and the parlements used this power ruthlessly to block any tax reform that threatened the privileges of the aristocracy. This produced a fatal structural problem. The king needed more revenue to run the state. The only way to get that revenue without borrowing was to tax the wealthy. But the institutional mechanisms that existed to implement tax reform were controlled by the very people who would have to pay. It was an almost perfect political deadlock, and it had been paralyzing French governance for decades before the Revolution. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had managed to override these obstacles through sheer force of personality and the centralization of power at Versailles. But his wars of expansion, particularly the War of the Spanish Succession, left France with enormous debts. Louis XV inherited those debts and added to them with the War of the Austrian Succession and the catastrophic 7 Years' War, which France lost badly in 1763. That defeat cost France nearly all of its North American possessions and further strained the treasury. By the time Louis XVI took the throne in 1774, at just 20 years old, France was already deeply in debt. The tax system was fundamentally broken, and the political machinery needed to fix it was gridlocked by the very elites who benefited from the status quo. This is a part of the story that popular accounts often skip almost entirely. They jump straight from the opulence of Versailles to the storming of the Bastille, as if one caused the other. But what actually happened in between was a series of financial disasters, each one compounding the last, each one making the final collapse more inevitable. The first, and arguably most consequential of these disasters, was France's decision to intervene in the American Revolution. This is one of history's great ironies. The war that helped birth American liberty also helped destroy the French monarchy. This was no accident. France entered the American War of Independence not out of some idealistic commitment to the principles of self-governance, but out of pure geopolitical revenge. France had been humiliated by Britain in the 7 Years' War. The loss of Canada, of Louisiana, of India. It was a wound that the French ruling class never forgot. When the American colonies began their rebellion against the British crown, France saw an opportunity to weaken its greatest rival by supporting the insurgents. Initially, French support remained covert. Starting in 1775, France secretly shipped supplies, weapons, and money to the Continental Army. But by 1778, France had signed a formal treaty of alliance with the fledgling United States and entered the war openly against Britain. French troops, French ships, French gold, all poured across the Atlantic. The decisive battle at Yorktown in 1781, the one that effectively ended the war, was only possible because of a French naval blockade and the presence of French soldiers fighting alongside the Americans. Strategically, it was a remarkable victory. Britain lost its most valuable colonies and France had its revenge, but the financial cost was staggering. France spent approximately 1.3 billion livres on the American war. To put that in perspective, the entire annual revenue of the French government at the time was roughly around 475 million livres. So France spent roughly 3 years' worth of national income on a war fought on another continent, for another people's independence, and nearly all of that expenditure was financed through borrowing. Before Necker, there had been another reformer who tried and failed, and Robert Jacques Turgot was appointed Controller General in 1774, and he was arguably the most capable economic mind to serve the French crown. Turgot was a genuine believer in free markets, a friend of the philosophe, and a man who understood that the French fiscal system needed radical surgery. His governing principles were straightforward. No bankruptcy, no increase in taxation, no borrowing. Instead, he would cut government spending, liberalize the grain trade, and abolish the corvée. He remained in office for less than 2 years. When Turgot deregulated the grain markets, allowing free trade in grain across provincial borders, the result was an immediate spike in bread prices in Paris as merchants redirected supply to wherever they could get the highest price. In late April and May of 1775, food shortages and soaring prices ignited an explosion of popular fury across the Paris basin. Over 300 riots and expeditions to pillage grain were recorded in just 3 weeks. The wave of unrest became known as the Flower War. Rioters invaded Versailles itself before spreading into Paris and out across the countryside. Turgot was forced to deploy the military to restore order, and the episode fatally weakened his political standing. The nobility and the parliaments who despised his reforms used the crisis as an excuse to demand his removal. In May of 1776, Louis dismissed him. The lesson was clear. In France, anyone who tried to fix the system would be destroyed by it. This is where Jacques Necker enters the picture, and this is where the tale becomes almost darkly absurd. Necker was a Swiss-born Protestant banker who was appointed to manage French finances in 1777. He was brilliant, charming, and wildly popular with the French public. He was also, as it turned out, one of the most consequential liars in modern history. Necker's approach to financing the American war was straightforward: rely on borrowing while avoiding new taxes. Between 1777 and 1781, Necker signed off on approximately 530 million livres in new loans, mostly sourced through bankers in his native Geneva and the Netherlands. He raised interest rates to attract lenders and avoided raising taxes on the privileged classes, which made him popular, but ensured that the structural problems in the French fiscal system went completely unaddressed. Then, in January of 1781, Necker did something that had never been done before in the history of the French monarchy. He published a document called the Compte rendu au roi, the account rendered to the king. For the very first time, the French public was shown a full accounting of the nation's finances. The publication caused a sensation. Over 100,000 copies were printed and sold. The public devoured it, and Necker was hailed as a financial genius, a reformer, a man of transparency. There was only one major problem. The document presented a deeply misleading picture. By cooking the books, by overestimating revenue and deliberately excluding the extraordinary expenses of the war, Necker managed to present a fictional surplus of 10 million livres. The reality was that France was running a deficit of roughly 70 million livres and was drowning in debt, but the public did not know this. The lenders did not know this. And crucially, the king himself did not fully grasp the severity of the situation. Necker's deception gave Louis XV a false sense of confidence in the economy, which encouraged him to continue supporting the American war effort even as the costs spiraled further out of control. The Compte rendu sold thousands of copies. It became the most widely read government document in French history up to that point, and it created something that had never existed before in France: a politically engaged public that believed it had a right to understand how its government spent money. This was a profound shift. Before Necker, the finances of the French crown had been treated as a state secret, as sacred and untouchable as the person of the king himself. But pulling back that curtain, even with false numbers, Necker inadvertently created an expectation of transparency that the monarchy could never take back. When subsequent finance ministers came along and tried to explain just how bad things really were, the public compared those grim numbers against Necker's rosy fiction and assumed someone was lying. Public trust had already begun to fracture. People simply could not understand how a government that Necker had shown to be running a surplus was suddenly on the verge of bankruptcy. And so, cynicism deepened, suspicion grew, and the credibility of the entire monarchical system took a blow from which it never recovered. Conservative voices at the royal court, including the foreign minister, Comte de Vergennes, and Marie Antoinette herself, were furious that Necker had revealed any financial information at all to ordinary citizens. In their view, the common people had no business knowing the state of the nation's accounts. To involve the public in such matters was seen as not merely presumptuous, but fundamentally subversive. It undermined the very principles of absolutist rule. In May of 1781, Louis XVIII asked for Necker's resignation, but the consequences were already irreversible. The debt was now enormous, the interest payments were crushing, and the next finance minister walked into a situation that was, by any reasonable measure, already beyond repair. Now here is what makes this story so much more complicated than the standard narrative suggests. The financial crisis by itself might not have been enough to produce a revolution. France had survived fiscal crises before. What made the 1780s different was that the financial catastrophe collided with a series of other crises that together combined into a perfect storm. The first of these was a natural disaster that most history textbooks barely mention. In June of 1783, a volcanic fissure called Laki erupted in Iceland. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. Over the next 8 months, the Laki fissure spewed approximately 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Skies across Europe darkened. A thick, persistent haze settled across the continent. In France, people described a blood-colored sun barely visible through the fog. The air quality deteriorated so badly that it caused respiratory illness and excess mortality across northern Europe. But the most devastating effect of the Laki eruption was what it did to the climate. The massive injection of sulfur into the atmosphere radically destabilized European weather patterns for years. The summer of 1783 was suddenly the hottest on record, triggering severe thunderstorms with hailstones large enough to kill livestock. Then came punishing winters, then droughts, then floods. The climate of the 1780s became wildly unpredictable, swinging between extremes in a way that French farmers had never experienced. And France was an overwhelmingly agricultural society. Roughly 80% of the population lived in rural areas, and the economy was fundamentally dependent on grain harvests. When harvests failed, the consequences spread through nearly every part of society. The 1780s were a catastrophic decade for French agriculture. 1782 brought a long winter and a wet spring that delayed sowing and ruined crops. The Laki eruption made 1783 and 1784 even worse. A drought hit in late 1784 and persisted through much of 1785, hammering cereal crops again. There was a brief respite in 1787 when conditions returned to normal and a decent harvest came in. Then 1788 delivered an even more devastating blow. The spring of 1788 was a disaster. 3/4 of France was gripped by drought. Then on the 13th of July, 1788, a catastrophic hailstorm ripped through the countryside around Paris, destroying crops across a vast swath of the most important agricultural region in the country. The hailstones were so large and the destruction so complete that entire communities were left destitute overnight. Then came the winter of 1788 to 1789, which was the coldest France had experienced in nearly a century. Rivers froze solid. Roads became impassable. The grain that had survived the hailstorm could not be transported. By early 1789, France was in the grip of a severe famine. And here is where you start to feel the true horror of the situation from the perspective of ordinary people. An average French worker in the 18th century spent roughly half of his daily wages on bread. Bread was not merely a side dish. It was the primary source of calories for the working population. When the grain harvests failed and bread prices began to climb, Families who were already spending 50% of their income on food suddenly found themselves spending 80 or even 90% of their household budget just to survive. Almost nothing remained for any other expense. Consumer demand for manufactured goods collapsed, which meant that urban workers began losing their jobs at the same time that food was becoming unaffordable. People were confronting hunger and unemployment at the same time. And this brings us to another factor that is almost completely absent from the popular telling of the revolution. In 1786, 2 years before the crisis reached its peak, France signed a trade agreement with Britain known as the Eden Treaty. This was a bilateral agreement designed to reduce tariffs between the two countries, inspired in part by Adam Smith's free trade arguments in The Wealth of Nations, which had been published a decade earlier. On paper, the agreement appeared progressive. France would lower tariffs on British manufactured goods, particularly textiles, and Britain would lower tariffs on French wines and luxury goods. In practice, the consequences for French industry were disastrous. British manufacturing, particularly in textiles, was already more advanced, more efficient, and more mechanized than its French counterpart. When the tariff barriers came down, cheap British goods flooded the French market and devastated French manufacturers. Factories closed, workers were laid off. Cities like Lyon, Rouen, and Amiens, which depended on textile production, were hit particularly hard. French manufacturers screamed for protection, but the treaty was locked in. The Eden Treaty became one of the most widely condemned policies in pre-revolutionary France, and it added an entire layer of industrial unemployment and economic resentment on top of the agricultural crisis and the fiscal collapse. So, by 1788, France was being crushed from every direction simultaneously. The government was drowning in debt from the American War and decades of borrowing. The tax system was broken and unreformable because the elites who controlled the institutions of government refused to give up their exemptions. The climate had turned hostile thanks to a volcanic eruption thousands of miles away. The harvests had failed repeatedly, driving bread prices to levels that made survival impossible for ordinary people. And a poorly conceived trade deal with Britain had gutted French industry and thrown urban workers out of their jobs. This was the environment in which the revolution actually emerged. The crisis went far beyond simple anger at the king. It was that the entire system, financial, agricultural, commercial, institutional, had failed at every level simultaneously, and the ruling class proved utterly incapable of responding. Now let us talk about that ruling class and its final, fatal miscalculation. By 1786, Charles-Alexandre de Calonne had taken over as Controller General of Finances. He had initially tried the same old strategy of borrowing more to cover the shortfall, but by this point the well was running dry. Creditors were demanding higher interest rates, and confidence in French solvency was collapsing. Calonne spent 2 years digging into the actual state of the finances, and what he discovered was alarming. The annual deficit had reached approximately 110 million livres. The total accumulated debt was approaching 4 billion livres. And one figure is particularly staggering. By the late 1780s, more than half of all government revenue was being consumed by interest payments on the debt. France was no longer dealing with an ordinary deficit. It had entered a debt spiral. It was borrowing money to pay the interest on money it had already borrowed. Calonne knew there was only one solution. The tax system had to be reformed. The nobility and the clergy had to start paying. He proposed a universal land tax that would apply to all landowners regardless of status, eliminating the exemptions that had protected the wealthy for centuries. It was the obvious answer, the only answer. But it was politically impossible. Calonne knew that the Parliament would never register such a reform, so he convinced Louis XVI to try something different. In February of 1787, the king convened an assembly of notables, 144 hand-picked members of the nobility and upper clergy, the first such assembly since 1626. Calonne's gamble was that these men, chosen for their supposed loyalty, would recognize the severity of the crisis and endorse his reforms, giving him the political leverage to bypass the parliaments. The gamble proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The notables refused to cooperate. They rejected the land tax. They rejected the elimination of their exemptions. They demanded full disclosure of the national accounts. And when Calonne reluctantly provided them, the true depth of the fiscal abyss became public knowledge for the first time. The empty treasury, the crushing debt, the annual deficit of over 100 million livres, the scale of the crisis was now exposed publicly. But instead of accepting responsibility, the notables blamed Calonne for the crisis. They accused him of mismanagement and extravagance. They called for his dismissal. And then they did something that would prove to be the single most consequential decision in the lead-up to the revolution. They insisted that only the Estates General, a representative assembly of all three estates that had not met since 1614, had the authority to approve such sweeping reforms. The king dissolved the Assembly of Notables in May of 1787 and dismissed Calonne. His replacement, Loménie de Brienne, tried to push similar reforms through the parlements and was blocked again. The parlements, which were run by the same nobility that had just torpedoed Calonne's proposals, refused to register new taxes and explicitly demanded that the Estates General be convened. When the king tried to force the issue, riots broke out in several cities. The nobility presented itself with breathtaking cynicism as a champion of the people's rights, when in reality they were fighting to preserve their own tax exemptions. By the summer of 1788, confidence in the government's credit had effectively collapsed. Lenders refused to extend new loans. The treasury was empty. Brienne was forced out, and in a desperate move, the king recalled Necker, the man whose false accounting had helped create the crisis in the first place, because Necker was the only figure who still commanded public trust. Necker agreed to convene the Estates General for May of 1789. And this is the moment, right here, where the story that most people know finally begins. But notice everything that had already happened by then. By the time the Estates General opened at Versailles on May the 5th, 1789, the crisis was already decades in the making. The debt had been accumulating since the reign of Louis XIV. The tax system had been broken for generations. The elites had systematically blocked every attempt at reform. A volcanic eruption on the other side of the world had destabilized the climate and destroyed the harvests. A trade treaty with Britain had gutted French industry, and a Swiss banker had lied to the entire nation about the state of its finances, enabling the king to fight a ruinously expensive war that he could not afford. The Estates General was intended to provide a solution, but it immediately became the catalyst for something far larger. The Third Estate, representing 98% of the population, demanded voting by head rather than by order. Under the old system, each estate got one vote, which meant the clergy and nobility could always outvote the commoners 2-1. When the king and the privileged estates refused to change this arrangement, the Third Estate broke away and declared itself a national assembly on the 17th of June. 3 days later, they took the famous tennis court oath, swearing not to disband until France had a new constitution. The king, indecisive and poorly advised, first seemed to accept the new assembly, then tried to suppress it. When he dismissed Necker on the 11th of July, 1789, the news exploded across an already tense Paris. The already starving, already furious population of the capital erupted. On the 14th of July, a crowd of Parisians stormed the Bastille, an old fortress and prison that symbolized royal authority. Militarily, it was not an especially important target. The Bastille held only 7 prisoners at the time, 4 of them forgers, 2 who were mentally ill, and 1 detained at the request of his own family. But symbolically, it represented something far greater than the prisoners it contained. The Bastille was the physical manifestation of the lettre de cachet, the sealed letters by which the king could imprison anyone indefinitely without trial or explanation. It was the symbol of a state that operated in secrecy, that punished without accountability, that taxed people into poverty, lied to them about the nation's finances, let them starve while the elites feasted, and then refused to change anything when given the chance. When the governor of the Bastille was dragged out by the mob and killed, his head paraded through the streets on a pike, it was not violence without context. It was the accumulated fury of decades of injustice finding its most visceral expression, and this is what most historians get wrong, or at least what they fail to emphasize adequately. The French Revolution cannot be understood primarily as a philosophical event. It was not caused by Voltaire's witticisms or Rousseau's social contract, however influential those ideas may have been. The Enlightenment provided the language and the intellectual framework through which people understood their grievances. But the grievances themselves were intensely material. People were hungry. They were broke. They had watched their government borrow and spend and lie and obstruct for decades while the privileged classes contributed nothing and blocked every reform. The Enlightenment gave them the words to articulate what was wrong, but the volcanic ash, the failed harvests, the fraudulent accounting, the crushing debt, the broken trade agreements, those were the actual forces that made that revolution happen. There's a tendency in historical writing to present the French Revolution as an inevitable triumph of ideas, the natural outcome of rational thought overcoming feudal superstition. That interpretation may flatter modern sensibilities, but it is incomplete. The revolution was born in chaos, in desperation, in the collision of financial incompetence, environmental catastrophe, institutional paralysis, and elite selfishness. It was not a neat story of inevitable progress. It was a dirty, brutal, terrifying breakdown of an entire system, and it happened because too many powerful people refused to sacrifice even a fraction of their privilege to prevent it. And there is an uncomfortable lesson in this that extends far beyond 18th century France, because the pattern, the structure of what happened is not unique to that time or that place. A government that borrows endlessly to avoid making difficult choices, an elite class that captures the institutions meant to serve the public and uses them to protect its own interests, a population that tolerates the arrangement until a crisis, often a crisis not caused by anyone's intentions, makes the existing order intolerable. And then the whole thing comes apart, faster and more violently than anyone expected. The French themselves had a term for the conspiracy theories that emerged during the worst of the famine. They called it the Pacte de Famine, the Famine Pact. The idea that the aristocracy was deliberately hoarding grain to starve the poor into submission. The claim itself was not true. The grain shortage was real, driven by climate and poor harvests, not by some aristocratic plot. But the paranoia was understandable in that environment. When you are watching your children starve while the people at the top of society are visibly prospering and refusing to reform a system that everyone knows is broken, conspiracy theories do not need to be true to feel true. And once that trust is gone, once the population believes that the system is not merely broken, but rigged against them, the social contract is already dead. Everything that follows is just the formality of its burial. The storming of the Bastille, the declaration of the rights of man, the abolition of feudalism, the execution of the king, the terror, the rise of Napoleon, all of those chapters of the revolution are well told and widely known. But those are consequences rather than the deeper causes. They are what happened after the system collapsed. The real story, the one that makes the revolution truly comprehensible, is the story of everything that happened before. It is the story of Louis XIV's wars and the debts they created. It is the story of the parlements and their obstruction of every reform that threatened aristocratic privilege. It is the story of the 7 Years' War and France's loss of its colonial empire. It is the story of a nation choosing to bankroll the American Revolution as an act of geopolitical revenge without the fiscal capacity to afford it. It is the story of Necker's fraudulent accounting, and the false confidence it created. It is the story of a volcanic eruption in Iceland that poisoned the atmosphere and destabilized the climate for years. It is the story of failed harvests and soaring bread prices. It is the story of the Eden Treaty and the destruction of French manufacturing. And it is the story of a nobility that, given one final chance to save itself by accepting reform, chose instead to protect its exemptions and demand an assembly that it could not control. Each of these factors contributed to the final cascade. Remove any one of them and the revolution might have been delayed, softened, or avoided entirely. Together they produced a cascading failure that no institution, no leader, and no ideology could contain. And that is what most historians get wrong, or at least get incomplete. They pick one thread, the Enlightenment, the class struggle, the personality of the king, the excesses of Marie Antoinette, and they present it as if it were the cause. But the French Revolution cannot be reduced to a single cause. It had dozens of causes operating simultaneously across different timescales, from the century-long accumulation of structural debt to the decade-long climate disaster, to the month-long bread crisis, to the day-long political confrontation at the Estates General. To tell the story properly, all of those threads have to be considered together. The French Revolution was not a moment of liberation that sprang from a philosophical awakening. It was a financial, ecological, institutional, and human catastrophe that exposed the fatal weakness of a system built on privilege, secrecy, and debt. The people of France did not revolt because they had read Rousseau. They revolted because they were starving, because the system that was supposed to protect them had been bankrupted by war and fraud, because the elites who controlled that system refused to reform it even when the alternative was total collapse, and because a volcano on the other side of the world made the worst harvest in living memory the final unbearable straw. That is the deeper origin of the French Revolution. And if you listen closely enough, you can hear echoes of it in the world around you today. If this story changed the way you think about history and the forces that shape our world, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next deep dive. I have got more stories like this coming, and I promise you they are going to challenge everything you thought you knew. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.